Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. I'm speaking to an awesome man who takes video game soundtracks and kind of converts them into film type scores. He's done it for Chrono Trigger, Zelda, Metroid, and more. Sam Dillard, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
No worries. I see you're quite well built, man. You're a really buff guy.
I probably not as good shape as I used to be, but it's a combination of just like being athletic and martial arts and all kinds of random stuff. But I think that it's important to have a healthy body as well as a healthy mind. So,
For sure, for sure. Because what type of martial arts do you do?
so I actually do what you would consider the traditional Chinese like kung fu stuff. So I do Tai Chi Chuan, which is the more martial, authentic version of Tai Chi, and my main style is called Xing Yi Chuan, which is a kind of military boxing style that's been around since like the 1500s. So it's pretty powerful, pretty cool. That's probably my favorite. But yeah, I do a couple animal styles. Some Chinese, what's called Chen Nao, like locking stuff. So just kind of a little mix of everything. But my main focus is on the what they call the internal arts, which is Tai Chi and Xing Yi Chuan.
Oh, right. So how did you get into that?
Well, mostly, I mean, I've always liked, martial arts flicks and stuff, Jet Li movies and things like that. But I had a friend who started learning. He lives about half an hour away, and he would come over and be like, "Hey, man, check this out," and knock me across the room. And I'd be like, "All right, yeah, whatever, that's pretty cool." So he kept pestering me to come check it out. And so I did. I expect to go in and see a bunch of big guys, wrestling each other and stuff because I'm very average size, and everyone in Texas is like 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. but but yeah, I went in there and it was interesting how they were talking about body mechanics, sort of using like redirecting force and stuff, and so that piqued like my science nerd aspect. And my friend ended up leaving shortly after, but I stayed, and I've been doing that about 15 years now or so. Yeah, about 15. Um, I happen to be lucky that this pretty well renowned sort of pioneer in the internal arts happens to live here in Texas, about half an hour away. Actually, I think he opened the first Chinese kung fu school in Texas and one of the first in the country. This was back in like the early 70s or so, after like the Bruce Lee kung fu and all the Bruce Lee sort of martial arts stuff was big in TV, and
Sure.
so a lot of people suddenly became interested in the Chinese martial arts and kung fu. So
Mm. Have you competed in any tournaments? You don't want to get into MMA or anything?
no, we're primarily a self defense and health school. So we do some sparring and stuff, but we've never really been interested in tournaments and things like that. Um, I mean, I I watch a little bit of MMA, boxing, stuff like that, but but for the most part, the emphasis is on you know what are you going to do if you you know walk outside and someone jumps out and attacks you, kind of thing. More realistic, I guess, kind of self defense stuff. But for the most part, like you know, it, there's kind of a divide between the traditional old school martial arts and like the MMA stuff. I'm not sure why this is like this, but it just is. But you've got like the MMA guys saying, "Oh, the kung fu stuff is just all for show," which honestly a lot of it is in modern times, because back in the communist revolution, which was the early 1900s or so, they basically started imprisoning all the people in China, all these masters and stuff who actually had skills and could possibly be some sort of threat to the new regime, like the dictator handbook 101 kind of a thing. And so a lot of those guys actually fled to the United States, and the founder of my school just happened to live next door to one of them. So We kind of have a sort of family style system that's been passed down for about 400 years now. So it's pretty cool to be a part of that. But you know, you've got the like this YouTube videos and stuff of the Tai Chi guys challenging some MMA guy to a fight and getting his ass beat because unfortunately a lot of the martial arts from China these days are either very watered down, which is intentional because they purposely sort of nerfed the martial arts styles in China so that nobody could really learn any kind of hand-to-hand combat skills or weapons or whatever. And it all became just sports, demonstrations and stuff. Like, see these really cool uh, young people in China and the Olympics and things like that, just doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And then, you know, 5 years later, they're wearing knee braces because that stuff takes a toll, and it's not really for martial intent. Um, but the difference, I guess, is that and you have this sort of Tai Chi culture now, which is it's cool that it's getting popular again, Tai Chi, but it's kind of getting popular for the wrong reasons because you have what you call the butterfly Tai Chi, where you have the old people in the park just kind of
Hmm.
around. You can make some nice movements, but there's no power there. There's no martial intent there. And so when one of these guys decides, to challenge some UFC dude, of course he's it's not going to go well for them. But that's kind of one of the reasons why finding a good sort of traditional martial arts school that is teaching the authentic version of the style for actual, combat self defense is pretty rare. And so I definitely consider myself lucky to have been a part of that.
Mm. Because do you watch a film and look at the martial arts and start critiquing it?
Sometimes, I mean, and it's the same with music, or I do like visual effects stuff. So whenever you're involved in the creative aspect of it, of course you're naturally gonna kind of critique it, or you can't help it. I try to just turn my brain off and enjoy it, but there's a lot of times when you'll see some fight that goes on for 10 minutes and everyone's like da 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 hitting each other. No human being that could ever possibly withstand getting punched in the face with the full powered body shot, over and over, and then still be uh, totally, you know, ready to go for another 10 minutes. So, like that kind of thing is a little annoying, especially when the movie is trying to present itself as being like authentic or realistic. And most of the time they're not because, in a real situation, it'll last a couple seconds. Pretty much whoever gets in the first hit is probably going to win. You don't have this fancy parrying and he blocks everything and the other guy blocks everything and you have this like back and forth kind of stuff. So that's a little bit cringy, but honestly, it doesn't bother me. As long as it looks cool, then I'm totally fine with it. So
Yeah. I think I read somewhere that you said that you apply the disciplines that you learned from martial arts into music. Can you explain how exactly?
well, there's a lot of, I guess, similarities between the martial arts idea, philosophy, and music. I mean, on the surface, you have things like timing, rhythm, and understanding the flow, how to blend between, two different types of things, which philosophically you could apply to music, but also, and especially in the internal arts, like the Tai Chi trend, um, there's a lot of emphasis on feeling and sensing what's happening. You touch someone's arm and you feel where their balance is, and you feel how the slightest movement can kind of, disrupt their balance, and then it's easy to push them over. So when working on music, um, that kind of sensitivity thing I find applies as well because you can kind of get the feeling that something's not really working too well. Because I'm not really what you call like a technical composer or artist, because I'm totally self-taught. I don't really know a whole lot of like music theory kind of stuff. So everything that I do is just purely based on how it feels and figuring things out by ear. And so everything that I do, I want it to have more than like just a good sound quality, which is important. I want it to have like an effect, make people feel something when they listen to it. And I think being able to, get in touch physically with how to kind of relax and find this zone where you're hypersensitive physically and mentally. I think they work pretty well together. And also, when the program crashes and you've lost like an hour of music, it's good to go out and punch things. So.
Fair enough, fair enough. Because one of the things I really like about the music you've done is the sound palette that you use, or the sample palette. It sounds really realistic. I mean, at first I thought you were using, a particular program or plugin, but you created this entire library on your own, right? You customized it.
Yeah, it's most of my stuff is heavily customized. When I first started doing digital music, mostly orchestral based. This is like the early 2000s, like 2003 or 4 or something like that. Most of the sound libraries were really hard to use and, very unuser friendly. And the funny thing is, the sound quality itself is just as good as it was today because, they've been recording, soundtracks or film and TV or whatever for decades. So it's not an issue of the actual sound quality, it's the issue of the playability and the usability of the instruments. And that's really where I am really picky about everything because, and my old keyboard here, which is about 20 years old, I have a customized orchestral thing that's touch sensitive. And it doesn't sound amazing, but it's very expressive. And that's what's important to me. And I kind of wanted that out of the more higher end computer orchestral samples. And so there might be, like one instrument that sounds great, but the other ones kind of sound, crappy, or it's not that they're crappy. It's just, it's not what I am personally looking for, like the certain tone that I look for. So I'll take like one instrument out of the library and I'll heavily customize it. Sometimes you basically just have to bounce it to audio and like edit the audio and like, filter it and stuff. Sometimes I'll put like a high pass filter to really get like an expressive sort of rise in the tone. Takes forever, but
Yeah.
The end result is if I feel like this has some kind of spirit to it, like some kind of life, then that's really really what I'm looking for in the music. So
Yeah, well, I thought for a small period that it was an actual live orchestra. So well done, man. Well done. I actually thought it was.
that's a big compliment because you know when I first started posting stuff online, this is probably 2005, 6, something like that. I'd been composing since I was 10 or 11 years old, but I never really shared. Of course, we didn't have internet back in the early 90s and stuff either, so you didn't really have an outlet. But when I started posting stuff, the first thing that people said was, this, did you actually record this? Because I thought everybody worked like that. I thought everybody spent, till 4 in the morning trying to tweak this one note to make it sound, perfect and realistic, because that's kind of what I wanted. Because I really love film scores, like the old school sort of 80s, 90s type stuff. And that's kind of always been my approach. So when I play something out and it sounds really flat and kind of, MIDI fakeish, I'll just dig in and try and find the most expressiveness that I can get out of all that stuff. And so it's not even that I'm trying to go for pure realism as I'm trying to go for, that liveliness, that playability. Because I play everything out on the keyboard. I don't, program notes or anything like that. Everything is, hand hand performed. And I have a lot of sort of touch sensitive filters on my keyboard that translate over. So you really have to kind of feel the music, I guess, a little bit more. And I think that's sort of become like my spiel, trying to get sort of this big, huge Hollywood style realistic symphonic sound out of for a long time were really old, really old samples. It really wasn't until recently that I started upgrading some of my hardware and my software to catch up with modern times. And now, of course, you load up like an instrument, and it's super playable and it's really easy. Back when I was doing orchestral stuff, like in the mid 2000s, you would have to literally like program every note transition, like one note up, it has sort of a legato sample, like a horn or something. Like you have to manually say, okay, this is transitioning from one note up and then one note down, and then like different velocity levels and stuff. Like you had to do all that manually. And now, it's a lot more fun because you could just play it out, and the software is pretty good at figuring out what you're trying to do. But even now, I still do a lot of customizing with my stuff because I just have uh, a really particular sound that I'm looking for, and I try to be consistent, with my work. Um, and it's been a very slow going process over many years, but I kind of figure out what works and what doesn't work, and it's also a matter of writing kind of music around what the limitations are, because if this instrument sounds really good in this little range here, but it kind of sounds weird, choppy or something later on, then I'll make the music just feature that in that one little register or whatever, and then figure out something else to do. I found that trying to force the instruments to do what you want them to do isn't always the best idea, because then you can kind of tell that it sort of brings you out of it, because you can say, oh, that sounds really fake or something. So
Yeah, well, it's very unique for you. I mean, the Metroid Cinematica project that you did, I mean, there's nothing like it. I haven't heard anything like it. And you did it quite a while ago now, didn't you?
yeah, that was my first big solo album, because Metroid has always been my favorite franchise. Super Metroid still, I think, my favorite game period of all time, and of course, I love the soundtrack as well. So I've always wanted to do like a full blown Metroid album. I've been doing Metroid remixes since I was like 12, and just on the old crappy Casio keyboards and stuff, like da 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 da, trying to play back the stuff, because I didn't have a computer or anything back then, so I would play the game and try and remember the tunes and try and figure out like how all the notes went, because I didn't know actual notation or anything like that, but and I still don't, honestly, but I kind of sort of got propelled into doing game music because of Metroid. And like when Super Metroid came out, it really made me want to be like a game designer and composer and all that stuff. And just over the years, I always seem to come back to Metroid. And I also like the techno industrial kind of sound of like the Metroid Prime games and stuff. And so what I wanted to do with Metroid Cinematica is basically do kind of the film score to like the non-existent movie type thing, because I kind of writ out like a plot, sort of beats that you would see in the movie. Is like, oh, she kills Mother Brain here, and then the planet's exploding. She flies out. That's one of the finale tracks, and I tried to convey that through the music, kind of musical storytelling type thing. But one of the things that I did was I tried to make sort of the Super Metroid, the older Metroids, kind of have more of the Prime sound, and so that was kind of my like design philosophy, is the big orchestral stuff, but what if Metroid, Super Metroid, or whatever, um, was written in the Prime sort of philosophy, because Prime has kind of a different tone than the older ones. It has that more sort of bizarre uh, electronic sort of ambient background stuff. I mean, the older ones did too, but that sort of, the best way I describe it is like radioactive. Like everything feels like radioactive in Metroid Prime. It just has that kind of bubbling strangeness, and I try to add some of that into the score, but overall it was kind of a fusion between that and just like a, what if this was like a big budget Hollywood film with a big huge cool epic type score. and that's been my approach for that. And it was pretty tough. It's pretty tough trying to figure out the best approach for each theme, because I didn't just want to redo the theme. Here's this, here's Kraid, here's Ridley or whatever. I wanted to really have kind of a unique approach to it, but still makes sense and flows, because every song kind of flows uh, into the next one, because I kind of designed the whole thing as one big sort of story block, and figured out, all right, this is where I'm going to put this. The big, the like the Omega Pirate battle thing's going to be here, and so I kind of arranged it like that, kind of almost more visually than just trying to come up with some cool some cool music. But I'm glad it turned out well.
Yeah. So did you? So I take it you created like a bit of a plot outline as a starting point, as a template, and then when you're composing it, were you thinking, okay, I'm going to include all these different tracks, kind of like a medley, or did you just kind of freestyle it? And then as you were doing it, you were like, oh, I'll introduce this theme and I'll do this here. Like how was it? How was the process of actually creating it?
Everything really. I did have kind of an outline, because this is just something that I've done a lot, because I also like to write. I like reading screenplays. I try to write stuff as much as I can. I've been doing that for about as long as I've been doing music. And so I've always had the idea of like coming up with like a cool Metroid, movie, and like here's the backstory and here's this and that. But when it comes to doing an album like this, like if it was for a film score, of course it would be the one to one matching to the picture and the story. But this is kind of like halfway between that. Like some parts, like yeah, I have like an actual outline of she's running away from something and something blows up, and then you kind of have that sort of soundtrack progression. But then because it's just an album for people to listen to, I also have a lot of stuff where it just is like, all right, this is a cool way to do this song, and it'll kind of flow into the next one. So it kind of goes between like a story thing, and then like just for the sake of making the music that the way that I wanted to do, because a lot of the stuff that I do is really just kind of making the music that I want to like to hear as a fan. Because it was a long time, this is before like OC Remix and these big sort of uh, remixing sites. It was a long time there where it was just like there wasn't any new Metroid games or anything like that, and so I would just kind of tinker around, like make my own fake Metroid score. This is before Metroid Prime came out. Like I made like 5 or 6 tracks of like, what was if I was doing the next Metroid game? How would that be? And just imagining these different areas and levels and stuff. So it's kind of a combination of all of that with Metroid Cinematica, but it has, for the most part, like a solid sort of story structure. Like it has the beginning, and then there's a track called Orphan that's supposed to be like Samus's backstory, and like imagine her like learning how to use all of her abilities and stuff, and like running and using like the speed boost for the first time, all just things like that. And that's kind of how the track progresses. And then later on you have like the big finale stuff where the planet is exploding and leaves, and then the last track is kind of like the resolution to all that, like she's walking out of the mist of this huge explosion or whatever. I try to convey that through the music as much as I can, which is difficult. I definitely went through a few different variations of it, but in the end you just it's kind of like taking a metal detector out somewhere. Is like you pick up a signal, and then it gets stronger here, and then you kind of zero in on this is the sound right here. This is the way it that feels right. So that's kind of how it ended up. And I wasn't sure if I would be able to pull it off, because I'd never done a full length album before. I'd done individual remixes, quite a few before that, but this was the first time that I said, all right, I'm going to spend some time and come up with an entire album. Um, I didn't know if anybody would ever hear it, but
Well, they did.
yeah, they did, and I'm very very glad that a lot of fans enjoyed it. So that kind of inspired me to keep doing more of these albums because it was, probably 6 or 7 months or something just working on that. Um, and then I did several more, and all of that because that first Metroid album did so well. So
Yeah, so did you apply the same techniques when you did, say, the Zelda one and the Chrono Trigger one?
sort of, each one kind of is its own beast. Um, I've always loved the Chrono Trigger soundtrack. Like it's probably still my favorite RPG. I just thought it was, you know, amazing.
Mm.
Mitsuda is just super awesome as far as that blending of like every type of genre and style together to make that really crazy, like timeless sort of sound for Chrono Trigger, which is very appropriate for the game that spans multiple timelines. And I kind of wanted to do something similar, but the trick is there's a lot of remixes out these days, a lot of really good covers of stuff, especially a few of the songs out of Chrono Trigger are remixed all the time, and you hear rock versions and the techno versions and the ambient versions. And so one of the things that I have to figure out is how can I find an interesting way to present this that stays true to the spirit of the original but has kind of my own vision for it. And so really Chrono Trigger wasn't so much a linear story type thing as Metroid was or Zelda, but it was kind of more like self-contained little mini stories. Like one of my tracks, the character Frog, who kind of ends up becoming this brave, knight character and finds a sword and cuts through the mountain. Like I kind of went through those story beats and his particular theme for the song. And then some of the others are just like, here's my take on if I had composed this song, here's kind of how I would have done it if I had taken, if I had magically absorbed, Mitsuda's inspiration for this particular track, like here's how I would have done it. And try to do again a more sort of cinematic, grand scale type sound to it. And yeah, that one was pretty tough as well. That was probably harder than Metroid because it's much more thematic. Like Metroid is a lot more ambient. There's the melodic stuff here and there, but for the most part, it's kind of alien background music, and that in a way makes it easier to work with because I can kind of do my own thing with it, and figure out my own way to kind of make it more melodic and thematic and stuff. But Chrono Trigger is very thematic, and it's really easy to just get into the rhythm of just redoing the track exactly the way it was with better sounding instruments, basically, which is not what I want to do. I want to reimagine everything. And I do a lot of times where I kind of morph themes together, or have two themes going like simultaneously and stuff. Like there's a split screen happening, and there's like two different storylines going on at the same time. So a lot of that kind of stuff. But it was a lot more self-contained as I went through it, and I think the sound quality is definitely improved with each album as I figure out how to, because I do all my mastering and editing myself as well, and so figuring out how to balance everything. I kind of learn a little something each time and try to apply everything that I've learned to the next one.
Because with Zelda has a lot of orchestral type elements to it anyway, unlike say maybe Chrono Trigger and Metroid, well, particularly the newer ones of Zelda, right? So say Breath of the Wild. It has a lot more orchestral elements. So how do you try to do something different? And Zelda gets remixed all the time. Pretty much every single genre has been done with Zelda. So how did you make sure that you were being distinctive?
Well, that is exactly the problem that I faced because, and again, if Super Metroid is my favorite game, I would say that A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo is probably my second favorite. I've been doing cover songs of that since I was a kid as well, and so I've always had ideas the way that I would do it, and then occasionally you'll hear like a someone does a really cool cover that's kind of similar to that. But my main approach is really saying, okay, if this was done as a film, like a really epic, grandiose adventure film, how would I do it? And my idea for Zelda Cinematica, because there's so many different Zelda games that are all like their own little self-contained universe, but all sort of kind of intertwined in this weird sort of multiverse type thing. Um, I try to imagine like this multiverse where there were all these different storylines happening together. And one of the approaches that I had to doing the music was sort of like for the Gerudo Valley score example, a that's a song that gets remixed all the time, and there's a lot of orchestral remixes as well. But my idea was this kind of swashbuckling like desert adventure film, like the old the Mummy movies and stuff. That was kind of my approach. So I try to maybe do a little bit more um, classical style with it. But another one of my big philosophies with my Zelda album was Breath of the Wild had just come out, and it had a very different tone with its music, very minimalist, kind of interesting ambient sound, which is very different than the previous Zelda games. And one of the things that I thought would be cool to do was, again, kind of like what I did with my Metroid soundtrack. What I did was I kind of reimagined some of the themes as if they were done Breath of the Wild style. So the sort of like minimalist sort of piano ambient type stuff, like I would say, all right, let's take this song and let's Breath of the Wild ify it, and make it kind of sound as if it were, you go into an area and all of a sudden it's like the Breath of the Wild version of this theme. So that was my approach for a lot of the stuff, and you kind of hear it sprinkled here and there. I didn't want it to overwhelm the album. I think because there's so many Zelda themes across so many different games, like the biggest challenge was just figuring out like what songs to use, how to use them, and how to put them together, because each track actually is designed as like one continuous song. Um, a lot of the themes directly phase into the next track, and that directly phases into the next track. Sometimes the theme doesn't even really finish in one track. It kind of ramps up and then it actually finishes in the next track as it's morphing to, another song. And so this is one of the reasons why it's better to listen to the album sequentially, in order, because it's very much designed that way. If you listen to it out of order, it just sounds, like you don't really see the connection between everything. But that was something that I spent a lot of time on, just making one big interconnected score. But the other trick was I didn't want it to just be like a symphony type presentation. Like, here's this theme, okay, here's that theme, okay. I really wanted everything to almost have like a playful dance, because there will be themes and then there's another totally different theme happening in the background. I took one of the tracks called Dangerous Elements. I took sort of some of the bosses, just the random bosses, or like there's a rock boss and there's an ice boss, and I thought what would be cool if you're fighting all these things together. And so I kind of have like there's the Talus, the big rock monster thing from Breath of the Wild. I had his theme kind of going in, and then it sort of becomes there's a thing called Mulgara in Wind Waker, and it was a pretty popular song. It's a big desert worm thing, and so I thought, how could I make these layer together? And I didn't just have it like cut from one theme to the next. I had them actually like there's a period where it's like they're both going simultaneously and they're like fused together. And I'm not sure why I did that. I just thought it'd be interesting, because it's always fun to try and figure out like how you can morph two different themes together, but if they feel like they're happening simultaneously, like part of the same story. I did this for one of my more popular tracks that I did a Star Trek big orchestral remix for all of the classical series, like the original. You had like Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and they all have really cool, theme songs. And so I kind of blended all of those together into like a single symphony, and I that just seems to be like my go-to style. Like instead of just having a medley where it's like, okay, here's this and this and this. Sometimes they're just all simultaneously happening, like one big crazy symphony. And I did that with a lot of the songs in Zelda. Another reason I did that was a practical reason because there's just so much music and it had to fit on a CD and or two CDs actually, but there's just there's really no other way without making like a 10 CD crazy like 6 hour long album or whatever to cover every single theme
Yeah, fair enough.
full length, and so I thought, all right, how can I sort of mix some of these together, and some of them just have cameos, like if it fits a particular sort of theme of a song, I'll have like a little cameo appearance of some random theme, but yeah, for the most part, it was very much sort of a film score style approach mixed with trying to see a lot of the stuff through the lens of the new Breath of the Wild sort of tone.
Mm. Because you also do animation as well, right? Or like visual effects. I mean, I saw your little, I think it's Beyond the Glass, is it? Where you did your little visual effect intro of the Meridia sequence from Metroid.
Right.
But that is so good. How long did it take you to do that?
Thank you. That took about 6 or 7 months.
7 months.
Yeah. I actually originally planned to do a longer sequence because this was basically just a music video for the song that I did, the Beyond the Glass song. I worked on a Metroid album, a big fan album called Harmony of a Hunter,
Yeah.
which had a lot of different artists involved, and I was one of them. And so I thought it would be cool to have a music video for my Meridia song. And so I storyboarded out this whole sequence. It's like 5 minutes long or however long the song was. And I started doing the animation. And, my computer was a little bit lacking for my ambition time. And, it would take like hours to render a few seconds. And it just became too much of a time sort of thing because I was just working on this. And a lot of that I was kind of figuring out as I went because I've been doing 3D animation and just visual art stuff on my own just as a hobby for a long time, but I'd never really like done anything with it as far as creating like a full-fledged animation, especially with like character animation and animated creatures and the whole like environment. And so a lot of that I was figuring out as I went, and it was just taking a long time. So you get like a 2 minute intro or whatever, and then it just like cuts to like game footage. And I actually got a lot of criticism for that because people were like, oh, why did you just stop it? Why didn't you finish the whole thing? I was like, I would if I could. I probably could now with the hardware that I have. But yeah, at that point it was just I wanted more than just a background with the song when I put it on YouTube, just a picture. I wanted a cool video to go with it. And yeah, that took about 7 months total, just for the 2 minutes or whatever.
I think a lot of people, particularly people who aren't creative, they don't understand how much time is involved just to do like these little visual effects. Even to make a song, right? It takes hours, weeks, months sometimes. So
Especially when you're hopelessly picky and perfectionist, like some of us are, probably to my detriment. But yeah, because I'll like obsess over like 1 second of a song, and just doesn't sound right, and I'll change the instruments. I'll put some effects on like the cymbal in the background, or I use a totally different thing, and a person listening to it would barely notice any difference. But for me, it's like a huge difference, and so that's why I don't have a huge volume of work. Like it takes me weeks to produce one song, sometimes like a month, and that's like staying up till 5 in the morning. It's like all of a sudden you get that rush of like creativity and then you do it, and then you wake up the next day and you're like, that actually doesn't sound as good as I thought. You
It's
know,
usually the
so you
case.
go back and change some things. But yeah, yeah, I'm definitely a slow moving composer and artist really when it comes to all that stuff. But I definitely prefer to have quality over quantity, and so I try to make sure that everything that I put out is as good as I can possibly do it at that time, with whatever I have. Which for a long time I was just using a really old computer, and some old samples, and trying to do the best that I could with that. And luckily over the years I've upgraded a little bit, but it still takes a while. Like the technical aspect of it and the creative aspect of it are really slow going. If you really want it to be something special, then you have to put in the time to make it that way. So
Yeah, because how do you find the time to do all this stuff, right? Because if you're doing martial arts, you're doing music, you're doing visual effects, I mean, you must be super busy. I mean, you say you stay up till 4 a.m., 5 a.m. When do you sleep?
sleep, what's that?
Yeah, yeah, what's that, right?
Yeah. Well, the main thing is like I don't really. This is a shock, but I don't really have that much of a social life. So it's not super hard to find the time to do this because this is just what I've always done, and I do freelance work, so I'm kind of doing everything on my own from home on my own schedule, and but really before that it was just a lot of years like this is all that I did. Like I would wake up and try and figure out, how do I do animation or whatever, or how do I learn how to edit videos and just mess around with it. How do I uh, make music? Because I didn't know anything about like MIDI connections or compute how to hook it up to the computer. Like I had to figure all that out when I was like 14, 15 or something like that. There was no YouTube to go on and say, how do you do this, or manual. And so it was just really, really a lot of trial and error, and it just took forever. But I think um, once you do that, it kind of develops a certain mindset, maybe, where you don't mind spending the time to figure out some crazy complicated thing, and takes weeks, months, whatever. Like it's, I guess, I can't say it's a discipline thing because I get frustrated a lot and I'm like, screw this, I give up and walk away. But then the next day I'm like, no, no, I got to do it. But but yeah, it's just a matter of tinkering with it, and it also helps if you have a drive, because I'm just a naturally kind of a nerdy guy. Like I really like science and technology and stuff, so it's interesting to read about the latest computer hardware, music stuff, and so I kind of live in that world anyway. And so I'm always just I'll tinker with music, I'll tinker with VFX. Luckily, it's gotten to a point where I can actually get jobs doing some of this stuff and make a little bit of income, because before I was just doing it on my own accord. Um,
Yeah. I mean, have you sent any of your stuff to any game companies or visual effects companies or anything like that?
no, I've seriously thought about moving because I live about 2.5 hours north of Austin, which is where like Retro Studios and some of those places are. But the problem is like I live kind of out in the country between like a lot of the big cities and stuff, and for the most part, I just kind of kept my stuff to myself because I didn't really think it was ever a viable like you know path. Because what I originally was doing was game development. That was kind of my big thing when I first got out of high school. I had learned how to do like 2D game design and stuff. The same software that they used to make Five Nights at Freddy's and these kind of 2D games. I had learned, figured out all that, and I moved to Atlanta to do some game design stuff. Like that was my main focus. But that was actually a little bit kind of like in the wrong place at the wrong time type thing, because this was before you had Steam and Xbox Live, these sort of indie platforms. And so at that time when you were working on a game as just a small studio or whatever, because I was working on stuff with my roommate who was also doing the same kind of stuff. We wanted to form a little studio, but indie studios were really hard to maintain back then because you either made it big and got some big publisher to pick you up or whatever, or if you did manage to actually produce like a CD or whatever, it ended up in like the $2 Walmart discount bin, the shovelware type thing. And so there was really no outlet at the time, and we were doing like rip-offs of like Pac-Man and stuff. Like some Asian game company wanted us to pay us to like just do like basically knockoff games for the Asian market or whatever, China or Taiwan or whatever it was. And that's not very satisfying creatively because I'm like, oh, I have all these ideas, this big like Chrono Trigger style like RPG thing, but it didn't seem like it was worth spending 2 or 3 years developing something, and then all you could really do is like post it on a forum, and like 10 people would see it, and nothing would really come of it. And so I said, all right, I'm just gonna shift gears a little bit because I'd be getting a little bit better at music. I'd been doing graphics, music, game stuff like all together, but I don't think I was particularly great at any of them. But I decided to focus on music, and so I moved back to Texas, and I kind of I sent a lot of my stuff to there was job sites where you can kind of subscribe to submit some of your stuff to, like it's like a job posting board type things. Like this studio needs some music for their underwater documentary, and submit some demos or whatever, and maybe they'll get in touch with you. But there's so many people doing that, I think that the likelihood of them seeing your stuff as someone who has like no college credentials, no real background like history in the industry, versus someone else who's like composed for like 5 different films or whatever at the time, like it is really hard to compete in that area. And so that was a struggle. But the irony is that as soon as I shifted my focus to music, all of a sudden you had like smartphones, and indie games and stuff suddenly became like the old school 2D like indie games that I was making when I was like 15 or whatever back in the 90s. All of a sudden you could actually do something with that. And so that was a little frustrating because I'd kind of gotten out of that scene. But that was, yeah, it's just one of those ironies of life, I guess. But I'd already committed to focusing on music and doing like game remixes and stuff. And people seem to like it. People seem to enjoy some of my Metroid stuff and the other random little things that I put out. And the nice thing about doing remixes is that there's a built-in audience there. People who like Zelda, they might not know who you are or care who you are if you just put out all your originals. Because I had a lot of original stuff on YouTube for a long time that I had like 20 views or whatever. And if I got like 100 views, I was like shocked, surprised, and elated. But yeah, I started doing this game stuff just because I've been doing that anyway on my own. I just never really shared it. But I started putting some of that out there and getting a lot of good feedback, a lot of views and stuff. And so I realized that if I really want to make it as a composer, or at least get, recognized, doing game remixes, especially with my style, because I kind of have my own sort of cinematic type style, that was a good way to do it. And so I just kind of kept with it, and it actually started to snowball. And then I, started doing these albums,
Yeah.
pretty popular. And then I did that my Zelda thing, and I put that on Kickstarter, and it did very well. I wanted to have each one. I wanted to kind of push it more because the first was just all digital with Metroid, and I thought it would be really cool to actually have a CD, album that people actually can have in their hands. I'd feel more like an authentic musician than just some guy in his bedroom making game stuff for fun. And so I ended up making a limited run of CDs for my Chrono Trigger album, and those were really well received. And then I wanted to push it forward again because vinyl has become really popular in the last few years again, making a big comeback. and so I wanted to have a vinyl release from my Zelda album, and so being super expensive, you need some good funding for that. So I did a Kickstarter and it did really well, and a lot of people really enjoyed it. And I think that's really what sort of keeps you going when you're kind of a you know do it yourself kind of composer person. It's like people really enjoy it and they send you messages asking for more. Like that's kind of the fuel that keeps that fire burning.
Yeah.
And
Have you been affected by COVID at all? I'd imagine not if you're a very, very much an introvert and keep to yourself.
well, I mean, about as much as most people, I guess, because here in Texas, anyway, I'm not sure how much you know about the southern U.S., but they tend to not to take science and medical emergencies such as a pandemic, for example, all that seriously.
I do know that, yes. The Bible Belt is, yeah.
So yeah, they kind of shut it down, but people still didn't really wear masks all that much and didn't really take it seriously. But then I guess once it got to a point where it was becoming like a major crisis, like then they really did shut everything down. For a while, the streets were like ghost towns, which was actually really nice because the traffic here is pretty bad going into town. So it was like a kind of a zombie apocalypse without the zombies. So that part was pretty cool. But yeah, for the most part, it's been like this, this dark cloud that's been slowly closing in. Because luckily, I live out in a little suburb town. I live away from the cities, and I don't really go out all that much. And so I've been doing my best to avoid it. But it slowly starts to creep in. Like some of my friends would catch it, and then my girlfriend ended up catching it. She works at Amazon, and Amazon's basically a COVID factory because you have thousands of people in close proximity, and a lot of which, they don't really wear their mask properly or whatever. Or if they're sick, they'll still come into work, crazy things like that. And so she ended up catching. So it did kind of get close to home. But I just got my first vaccine shot, the microchips. I mean, I'm still not getting any 5G yet. I'm waiting for that. But yeah, as far as my work and everything, it did have a bad impact in that I had a few gigs lined up. I had a film score thing that I was supposed to do last year that the film industry really got impacted by COVID, especially like overseas, because you don't have people in theaters anymore. So that and some of those gigs got like pushed back or canceled or changed or whatever. So it did kind of impact my work. But as far as my just daily life, I'm already like living like I'm in a pandemic. So that's just kind of my natural state, being introverted, as you said. And hasn't been too bad. Luckily, we're kind of coming out of the the slope. Hopefully, with the vaccines and all of that stuff, the world can kind of get to some sort of normalcy, if that's possible. I still think that you know this whole like Zoom communication culture, which really sort of grew out of the COVID emergency, actually is pretty nice because now you have a lot more people communicating virtually, and it's a lot easier to get a group of people together, you know, through a conference type meeting thing than it is in person. Because some of my martial arts classes, um, we would have people like, because it's such a, it requires so much dedication and a lot of time investment to learn, just how to stand properly or how to move and use your whole body together. Like, it's not for everyone. And so our classes had been kind of, shrinking down as the like overall martial arts sort of craze has kind of settled down a bit. But now we have, classes bigger than we used to virtually, because people who live in like, England or, the northern United States, all of these people can show up to a virtual class. So in a way, the online sort of thing has actually had at least a nice side effect, as opposed to just totally shutting everything. Because of course you can't have a martial arts class where you're touching, throwing people around when there's a pandemic going on. So, we've had to shut those down over the last year. But it's actually had that nice secondary effect of getting people together, communicating again virtually at least. So
Yeah.
that's interesting.
I think there'll be two elements once normality somewhat returns. You'll have some things that will go back to the way they were, and there'll be some things that are forever changed.
Yeah,
As
like
to yeah, as to what that'll be, I mean, you might be able to do both uh, Zoom and venues. Yeah,
you have like offices and things like that. News, a lot of the newscasters are doing that from home, and I'm pretty sure that once you start doing something from home, um, you kind of have a hard time going back into the office again. And so I think it really will kind of change the overall sort of work culture, you know, because if you can accomplish everything virtually from here, talking to someone, through Zoom or whatever, um, why why have an environment where you have to, get everyone together again? Like offices are getting more like open. I think the ones that are open have like COVID walls or whatever, big glass walls. Restaurants are kind of designed differently. Um, the good thing, at least, is that people are paying a lot more attention to personal hygiene, which is can be a problem, especially in the South, where it gets a little dirty sometimes. But people, I think, once COVID started happening, and the flu actually started going down, the flu levels, because people were wearing masks and social distancing. So it had this whole secondary effect of like, some other annoying seasonal type, stuff that happens actually got better because of that. So it's definitely the most impactful thing I think we've had in our generation.
I agree.
Your grandparents have like, the war and everything, but for a long time, we've had really nothing that impacted our culture or our daily life like this. And so all of a sudden you have people who have to wear masks and they're complaining, it's too restricting, it's controlling my life or whatever. If this is your idea of what's controlling your life or having it rough, then, go back a few decades and they they might have their minds a little bit changed. But I think for the most part, if we ever get out of it, because they're always having new variants and stuff. But I think it's been an interesting eye opener, and it's certainly made a lot of changes as far as the way people think about going out again.
Mm.
Definitely an interesting time to be alive.
So, as someone who's living in Texas, and from what I gather, you seem to have a different mentality than a lot of the rhetoric that goes around there.
Yeah,
So,
that's fair to say.
yeah. So, why do you choose to stay in Texas? What is it about Texas that you love, as opposed to any of the other states?
Well, at this point I've traveled, a good portion of the U.S. and I'm a Texan. I was born in Fort Worth. This is my home. I grew up in Florida actually, but all of my family's here, and really it's you have places like Austin and Dallas. It's I think different than people kind of imagine from the outside. Most people when they think of Texas just think of a dusty town where everyone's wearing cowboy boots and ready to have a shootout at the corral or whatever, the typical kind of
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
stereotype. But Texas is such a big place, and it's actually very diverse, that you have a lot of really sort of progressive artsy stuff going on here. Again, like Austin with retro studios. You have a lot of like game stuff happening here. Film stuff is starting to happen here. Definitely music. Austin's a really big music town, so there's there's a lot to like in Texas. I think it's
Yeah.
just you have to sometimes walk around some of the you know the southern stereotypes that do exist, unfortunately.
So just avoid them, pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my philosophy anyway.
Yeah.
That's why I do all the stuff that I do, because I definitely didn't fit in with like the farmer kids and stuff when I was in school. So, but I do like, getting out and adventuring, going hiking, things like that. And there's a lot of nice areas in Texas if you're into that sort of thing. So I think it's as far as places to live, you could do much worse than living in Texas.
So you do take holidays?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I just thought you might not because you work so much.
I've yeah, we try to travel every now and then, get out of the house. Definitely when you spend a lot of your time in the same sort of room, just working on the same kind of stuff day in, day out, all day, all night, it definitely starts to mentally sort of turn you into like a hermit. And you have to get out. That's why I say, having a good balance between the mental and the physical is extremely important. Get out, exercise, martial arts, hike, whatever you want to do, surfing or whatever. If I was still living in Florida, I would probably be surfing all the time because I like the ocean a lot. But it's definitely important to balance that out because otherwise, if I didn't do that, given the amount of time that I spend in front of the computer and the keyboard and everything, I feel like I probably would have grown into like the chair by now. It looked like the thing in Alien or whatever that's part of the ship or whatever. So I think it's definitely important to get out and be a part of the world. And Texas is definitely a nice place. We have some interesting stuff. We have a nice park called Dinosaur Valley where you can go walk with the dinosaur footprints and stuff. So, and that's just right around the corner. There's a lot of cool stuff here. So I think it's you could definitely do a lot worse. But our power system could certainly use some upgrading because when you run out of power in the middle of an Arctic freeze, it's definitely not fun. And that's all from the rhetoric of wanting to be independent. And Texas kind of has this mentality of being their own country. We'll talk about seceding from the U.S. all the time, which
it won't happen.
Is silly, but yeah, it's definitely one of the more interesting states, I would say. Of course, I'm biased, but then again, I have seen quite a lot of the United States already, and I like it here. So it does get a little too hot in the summer, though.
Pros and cons to everything, but hey, that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much for doing this. Now, if anyone wants to follow any of your stuff, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a lot of stuff on YouTube. My online name is Samos Studios, so youtube.com Samos Studios. My main website is samosstudios.com, and this August I'm planning to release an updated version of my Metroid Cinematica album. So that'll, I think, be worth following for if you might happen to be interested in Metroid. I'm going to try and get a vinyl release for it. So that'll be pretty cool, I think.
Cool.
And yeah.
Sweet. And if anyone wants to do one of your Zoom martial arts courses, how do people do that?
Well, right now it's kind of a private sort of class thing. Okay. I'm hoping one day, maybe once the pandemic sort of dissipates, to open up my own school somewhere. So that'll definitely be another thing that I'll have on my site. But for now, just trying to survive the zombie apocalypse 2020, 2021 crossover that's happening.
Yep, very much agree. Cool. All right. Well, hey, thanks so much for doing this, man. Before we go, are you gonna jam something on the keys? Do you want to jam anything on the keys? Yeah. Anything you want to jam, man.
So we were talking about Zelda. So most of my brainstorming stuff I do with my old keyboard, and this is the 20-year-old keyboard, so it doesn't sound great, but it has programmed the way that I want it to, and so I'll usually do like. that's kind of how I will come up with my stuff. I have it like velocity sensitive with like a timpani and all that, and 90% of my brainstorm is using my old keyboard, coming up with, how does this sound, if I add some character to it. But yeah, I still love my keyboard. Most of my music originally actually used samples from my keyboard, even though they're kind of bad quality samples. They're really compressed and everything because there's limited memory, but they have an expressiveness, that kind of reactiveness to the playing, and that's kind of what I try to emulate with my stuff. And so that's, people ask me, what libraries do you use? How do you get the sound? A lot of it is actually just layered with my old timey keyboard, adding in kind of like the backbone to it, and takes a lot of processing and how to mix it to sound good. But yeah, sometimes if it ain't broke, there's no point in fixing it. So
Totally agree. Well, hey man, this has been great. Thank you so much for doing this. I very much appreciate it.
I appreciate the chat. It's been really fun.
Yeah. All right, well, that's the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. Support the bro Sam. Follow all his stuff on YouTube. It is great. You can definitely appreciate it, even if you're not a musician or an audio engineer. So yeah. All right. Stay safe, everyone.